Welcome to the lecture on The Known World by Edward P. Jones, a very successful novel when it appeared in the early 2000s. As you can see from all the encomiums on the back of the book and even on its cover, and in the first few pages you'll see blurbs from different book reviews. You'll also see the little circle on the cover which notes that it actually won the Pulitzer Prize the year it was published. I wanted to give you a little bit of a framework for understanding the book as we begin it because it can be very jarring. We're jumping in terms of the time period, and I want to explain why we're doing that, why we're moving away from the American Renaissance. First, though, I want to give you a little bit of an update on the conference I attended. This past week, went to a conference of the Association of the Society of 18th Century Studies, people who study the long 18th century. Now that actually can be from 1660 to about 1830, so it spills over from the 18th century to the early 19th and the late 17th century. And there I was noticing a lot of emphasis on panels and research on slavery, which there always is, but maybe a little bit of an uptick this year. Still, though, a lot of it revolves around silence. So, for instance, I heard a paper that a scholar gave on a Georgic poem called The Sugar Cane by a plantation owner and doctor named James Granger from the Caribbean. It was published in 1764. And one of the things that again comes up as he's talking about the production of sugar is how much he doesn't detail of how this product really relies on slave labor and how difficult that labor was, how actually deadly it was to the people who were enslaved and had to help in its production. So even though there's a little bit of a note at the beginning of the poem, and it seems to sometimes imply sentiments opposing the practice of slavery, the poem itself is very timid and ultimately kind of erases that African American presence. And we see that over and over again in text in the 19th century in particular, that there is a kind of whitewashing of U.S. culture. Very little is sometimes noted about the presence of slaves. Sometimes the presence is on the margins. There is a sense that there is a refusal to really confront that aspect of American life. In general, what we usually teach in classes like ours are first-person accounts by people who actually lived in slavery. That really just focuses, though, on one person's account, and a lot of times someone who was lucky enough to get into a situation in which they could either run away or earn their own freedom. We'll talk about some of those famous accounts. Many of you maybe read them or teach them, and they're great texts, and I debated whether or not to read another one of those. I decided, though, to teach The Known World, to jump to a different era, in part because it really tries to capture that time, and we really rely on artists now to try to deal with that past. There's so many different aspects of slavery that made it hard to have representation, to have voices of people who were held in slavery. It was part of the institutionalization of slavery to silence those voices. And so we end up focusing just on those individual people. What's nice about The Known World is it kind of opens up the whole network of all the people who kind of support that system and the different peoples who actually participated in it willingly or unwillingly, and gives you a much broader perspective. And even though it's a work of imaginative fiction, like even when he's citing historians, those are made up historians. So it's all fictional, with based on in the reality that there were some slaveholding African Americans, few, in Virginia in the 19th century. We can't really talk about slavery in the U.S. without mentioning Uncle Tom's Cabin, a novel by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And we cannot underestimate or think about how important and influential that text was to U.S. culture. It was the bestseller, second only to the Bible in the 19th century, and really shaped people's conceptions of the South. And even people who refuse to read it, it's still a dominant text. There are people in the South who do not think that Harriet Beecher Stowe is fair to them, still to this day. But a lot of times in literature classes we focus on slave narratives, and it's a genre that allows actual slaves to speak and testify to their experience. If you're looking at slave narratives, there are some key features I just wanted us to run through. One of which is there's an obsession with authenticity, fears that people will be accused of posing as a slave, like maybe you're an abolitionist and writing like a hoax text in order to serve as propaganda to end the practice of slavery. So a lot of times those texts open, and actually the very first thing you'll see are pages from white people saying, I've met this person, I know their story's true, they verified, and usually someone really well respected, that you'd say, okay, I trust this person, they would not lie to the public like this. And so there has to be a lot of, this is a true story, and there's a lot of emphasis on that. The other thing too is that if you open up those books, a lot of times it's, I can't tell you when I was born, I don't know my own birth date, I don't know exactly where I was born, I don't know who my own mother is. And never mind, I don't know who my father is. And so those details that often open someone's autobiography, the story of their life, or what we call life writing, are just basic facts that a lot of times slaves are robbed of. And so it's an interesting genre to juxtapose against other kinds of autobiographies. A lot of emphasis on family and the disruption of family life, especially because in the 19th century, there was this valorization of family life. This is when you get these depictions of mothering as this, duty that women are called to do in order to raise productive people, and the mom is the heart of the home, and the angel in the house is there performing all these tasks, serving others through this bounty of love. And so as you have that ideology of the family cementing itself in the 19th century, you meanwhile have this utter destruction of family life going on among people who are held in slavery, in which children are torn from parents, in which people are not allowed to marry. Marriage is illegal for a slave in many of the states in the South. Sometimes they're quasi-married, and so everything about it is disrupting that sense of family life. And that, I think, is something that we still try to wrap our minds around and understand how that was a fabric of American life, even at the time when people are really focusing on the family as this core unit. Literacy. So if you have a slave narrative, one of the first questions is, how did you learn to read and write? Especially because in the early 19th century, some slave states made it illegal for even a white person to teach a slave to read or write. So you could be prosecuted as a white person for teaching an enslaved person how to read and write. Again, you can see how slavery becomes institutionalized, and keeping people ignorant was part of that system. The other thing that comes up in a lot of those texts is the author's engagement with Enlightenment thought. The same thought that led to the American Revolution or independence or the French Revolution or different changes in the modern world, using those ideas to argue for the end of slavery. And even looking at things like The Rights of Man by Thomas Paine, or looking at Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and saying, hey, right here, here's the justification for ending slavery. And a lot of times these narratives are rooted sometimes in Christianity and in that it's doing the right thing to end slavery, but a lot of times rooted in reason and logic, of using those ways of thinking perpetuated by the Enlightenment to kind of show, here, I am capable of being an enlightened modern person, just like everybody else, even though I was once held in slavery, but also as a way to convince others. Now, maybe before I talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin, let's talk about some of the most famous first-person accounts. Olaudah Equiano, he's writing in the late 18th century, and everybody wants to claim Equiano. You should definitely read his narrative if you haven't already, because he's someone who, well, he claims he was born in Africa and that he actually went through the Middle Passage. But he's someone who earns his own freedom, and a lot of times, when you read him in an American literature class, they really talk about him as, this kind of like self-made man. They read him as like kind of this slavery, former slave kind of version of Benjamin Franklin's rise to wealth, because Equiano eventually, earns his own freedom and becomes a very prosperous person. Now, he's also taught in British literature classes because he becomes a British subject by choice. And he's really a lot of an Anglophile. And I think when you look at him in a British literature class, he's taught in a different way. He's also usually the first text that's taught in a class just on African American literature. And he has a great story to tell, and he's a great writer. and many incidents that are kind of part of our imaginary about life in slavery. The most famous American abolitionist is Frederick Douglass, a man who ran away from slavery and wrote a number of autobiographies. A lot of times high school teachers teach the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, and that was published in the 1840s. A lot of times scholars, Douglass himself kind of said, he kind of felt like white abolitionists were kind of constraining him in that story in terms of what they wanted him to put forth. So later on in the 1850s, he writes a text called My Bondage and My Freedom. I actually prefer that autobiography by Douglass. I like it, and he kind of sees it as more of his telling his own story. Right now, anthologies sometimes include excerpts from both. It's very interesting to see how that story transforms. Later on in his life, he writes another autobiography because he was such an influential American figure. He was a great orator. He's a great writer. And he made a very compelling case just through his own bearing, through his own thought for abolishing slavery. He becomes a major figure in American life, meeting presidents. And I know he was in the news was it last year? Because there was an incident in which our current president seemed to refer to him as though he were still alive. But he's kind of pops up every once in a while. Now, a lot of the narratives that we have by people who lived in slavery who were women are ones like Sojourner Truth. And those are great, but a lot of times, or Harriet Tubman, those women were actually illiterate. And so if we have their stories, it was told to someone else. We do, though, have an entire narrative by a woman named Harriet Jacobs. That's her real name. She uses a fake name, Linda Brent, when she tells her story, and it's called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. You should definitely read that text as well. If you have the opportunity, it is strange. Now, she's someone who actually grows up with her family, even though she's enslaved. She knows who her grandmother is. She's pretty silent on who the grandfather is. But her text is wild because she actually runs away from slavery, but stays in the South. She's in hiding, and very much is part of the American tradition of captivity narratives. And then how she negotiates herself, her life as a woman in slavery. She says it's different for women. She makes a strong case. She says it's worse for women because of the sexual exploitation. And I know that I just taught Harriet Jacobs last fall, and it was interesting to read that in the context of the Me Too movement, of people being much more vocal about sexual harassment in their jobs, sexual exploitation, or rape. And reading Harriet Jacobs, who's testifying to that experience for slave women who had no rights, who were literally owned by the people who were often harassing them and violating them. And so that's a whole other aspect of American life that we don't necessarily talk about. And for 19th century readers, it's not something that they wanted to deal with at all. And so she really has to negotiate how to talk about this frank assessment of what a woman's life is like in slavery while not offending her audience. It's a tricky feat, but you should check those out. Now, Uncle Tom's